Europe is seen as hugely important for the car industry in the UK. The uncertainty about the future of the trading relationship with Europe is already, I think, starting to have an impact. We've seen a reduction in investment in the industry over the last year. It was running at about 1.65 billion in 2016, down to less than 300 million or so around there in the first part of this year. And one of the big issues is over the next few years, as Article 50 negotiations go on, there are some big investment decisions that major manufacturers will need to make. So, for example, Peugeot, which has taken over General Motors, will make a decision on the next generation Astra, which was to be built in 2021, sometime next year, slap bang in the middle of Article 50 negotiations. So there's going to be a big question mark about whether that company will decide to locate that model in the UK, given that uncertainty about the future of the UK's trading relationship with Europe down the line. There are also questions there, for example, about the fact that it is easy actually, or easier to fire workers in the UK, make them redundant as compared to, say, France, and the fact that the French government will be supporting Peugeot in retaining jobs in France. So it's important, I think, that we end the uncertainty as soon as possible. The car industry has been quite clear that there needs to be some sort of transition deal as quickly as possible to underpin certainty in the industry, to try and make sure that we don't lose investment going forward. Longer term, I think there's a number of issues that the car industry and other manufacturing sectors need to see. Firstly, they want as much access as possible to the single market. In the case of the car industry, over 50% of exports from the UK of cars go to the European Union. So this is a hugely important market for car producers in the UK. And several car companies have actually come to the UK to serve the single market, if you think of the Japanese producers, for example. So they want to see a closest relationship as possible with Europe in terms of access to that single market. Second issue, I think, is around skills. 1 in 10 workers in UK manufacturing comes from another EU country. Honda recently, in evidence to a select committee, said that 14% of its workers come from another EU country. Now, we haven't been nearly as good in the UK as we should be about training skilled workers in engineering and science, and so often we've had to look to European countries to bring in the right skills. If that becomes more difficult with Brexit, and that could increase cost for producers here and make it more difficult for them to actually source the skills that they need. So not only do we need to be doing much more to train and skill our own workers, but we need to keep open access in terms of bringing in workers from the European Union with the skills that we want. The next issue I think is hugely important is about technology. So lots of European funding through Horizon 2020 has gone into, for example, supply chain firms in the UK to develop new technologies. Also, we've seen very significant funding from the European Investment Bank, which has gone into the UK car industry to develop low carbon technologies. Now, going forwards, of course, if the UK is not in the EU, it won't be a member of the European Investment Bank. That funding won't be coming to UK manufacturers. So we need to find ways of funding research in these new technologies in the UK. That calls, I think, for a much more developed industrial strategy. We'll hear about that in coming weeks in terms of funding and supporting the sorts of research that will be needed in manufacturing going forward. And then a sort of final point that I think is worth emphasising is around regulation. So increasingly it's regulations which get in the way of trade. And over time, if those regulations differ, then it means that there are effectively barriers to trade, non-tariff barriers in effect. So it's important that we harmonise regulations, for example, in the car industry in the UK with the European car industry. Going forward, regulations aren't going to disappear. In many senses, they will become even more intense as we move into an era of connected cars and driverless cars and this mobility revolution that we're going to see coming down the line. So we need to be able to make sure we work with the European Union to develop common regulations and make sure that the UK doesn't diverge too much from European regulatory standards. In the short term, I think we need some sort of clarity about membership of a customs union with a regulatory system alongside it. Ideally, I think as much access as possible to the single market will be needed in order to keep the UK an attractive place for for investment in the auto industry and an attractive place to develop new technologies going forward.